The empty desert highway stretched ahead like a ribbon of black silk under the pale glow of the moon. James gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles whitening as he glanced at his girlfriend Lucy, who was dozing in the passenger seat. Her head rested against the window, strands of her dark hair plastered to the glass by her breath. Behind them, their two friends, Mike and Emma, had also succumbed to sleep, their heads lolling awkwardly as the car hummed along the lonely road. They had taken the detour to save time. The GPS had warned them it was an unverified route, but James, eager to shave off an hour of driving, insisted. Besides, it was just a road through the desert. What could possibly go wrong? The faint sound of static from the radio filled the silence, interspersed with bursts of ghostly whispers when James fiddled with the dial, trying to tune in a station. All he managed to catch were snippets of incomprehensible chatter before giving up. The first sign of trouble was the mile marker. James noticed it flash by in the headlights. Mile marker 207. Nothing unusual, except 10 minutes later, when another marker came into view, it was the exact same number. Mile marker 207, he muttered under his breath. He frowned, gripping the wheel tighter. Maybe he had imagined it. A glance at the gas gauge didn't help his unease. The needle was lower than it should have been, despite having filled up just a couple of hours ago. Still, he didn't want to alarm anyone. They'd laugh, chalk it up to desert weirdness, and besides, they were all tired. James resolved to keep driving. Another mile marker appeared. Mile marker 207. This time, the skin on the back of his neck prickled. He slowed the car, leaning forward to squint at the sign as they passed it. Was someone messing with them? But there were no signs of habitation out here, just the endless expanse of sagebrush, sand, and rocks. Lucy stirred awake. "What's wrong?" she asked, her voice groggy. James hesitated, glancing at her. "It's nothing, just something weird with the mile markers." She frowned, rubbing her eyes. "What do you mean?" Before he could answer, Mike's voice came from the back seat. "Hey guys, look." James followed Mike's pointing finger to the rearview mirror. Far behind them, on the horizon, was a pair of headlights. They were faint, but steady. "Probably another car," James said, but his voice lacked confidence. He hadn't seen another vehicle for hours. He kept checking the mirror as the minutes passed. The headlights grew brighter, closer, until they were a sharp gleam in the darkness. The car behind them didn't pass. It didn't slow. It just stayed behind them, its high beams glaring into James's rearview mirror like twin suns. James tapped the brakes lightly, hoping the car would pass, but it stayed right on their tail. "What the hell is this guy's problem?" he muttered, squinting against the glare. Lucy turned to look out the back window. "Maybe they're in trouble or something. Should we pull over?" James shook his head firmly. "No way. Not out here. They can go around if they're in such a hurry." The car didn't go around. It stayed close, its lights relentless, until James swore under his breath and slammed his foot on the gas. The engine roared as they sped up, the desert whipping past in a blur. "James, slow down," Lucy protested, gripping the dashboard. "I'm not letting this guy tailgate me," he snapped. But no matter how fast they went, the car stayed right behind them, its headlights unwavering. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the car veered off the road and vanished into the darkness. No sound, no dust kicked up by tires, just gone. James slammed on the brakes, sending the car skidding to a stop. Everyone was wide awake now, their breathing ragged in the thick silence. Did you see where it went?" Emma asked, her voice trembling. "No," James said, his hands shaking as he gripped the wheel. "It just disappeared." The group sat in stunned silence, staring out into the blackness. Finally, James shook his head and started driving again, slower this time. That's when they saw it, a figure standing in the middle of the road. James's foot hit the brake, the tires screeching as they came to a stop just feet away from the figure. It was a woman, barefoot and dressed in tattered clothes, her hair hanging in matted strands around her face. Her head was tilted at an unnatural angle and her arms hung limply at her sides. Lucy gasped. "Oh my God, is she hurt?" "Don't get out," Mike said sharply. "Something's not right." But Lucy was already unbuckling her seatbelt. "We can't just leave her here." "Lucy, wait!" James shouted, but she had opened the door and stepped out. The woman didn't move. "Are you okay?" Lucy called, taking a cautious step forward. The woman's head jerked up, her eyes glinting like shards of glass in the headlights. She smiled. The smile stretched too wide, her lips cracking open to reveal jagged, blood-stained teeth. Lucy froze. "Get back in the car!" James yelled, leaning across the seat to grab her. But before he could, the woman moved. She didn't walk. She glided, her body jerking like a marionette as she closed the distance between them. Lucy screamed, stumbling backward as James yanked her into the car and slammed the door. The woman's face appeared at the driver's side window, her mouth still twisted into that grotesque smile. She raised a hand and tapped on the glass with a long, yellowed fingernail. "Drive," Mike whispered. James didn't need to be told twice. He floored it, the tires spitting gravel as they sped away. The woman didn't chase them. But when James glanced in the rearview mirror, she was still standing in the middle of the road, her head cocked at that unnatural angle, watching them. The mile markers began to change after that. Mile marker 208, mile marker 209, but none of them felt relieved. The road stretched on endlessly, and no matter how far they drove, they couldn't shake the feeling that something was following them, something they couldn't see. When dawn finally broke, they found themselves pulling into a small, dusty gas station. The attendant looked up as they stumbled out of the car, pale and shaken. "You kids come off Route 207? He asked, his voice tinged with concern. James frowned. "Yeah. Why?" The man shook his head slowly. "That road's been closed for years, washed out after a flood. Ain't nothing down there but empty desert." Lucy turned, her face ashen. "But we saw." The attendant held up a hand. "I don't want to know. Just be glad you made it out." And as they got back into the car, James couldn't help but glance in the rearview mirror one last time. For just a moment, he thought he saw headlights. The four friends had been looking forward to this road trip for months. Alex, Melissa, Jake, and Natalie piled into Alex's ancient SUV, their excitement buzzing as they headed deep into the Appalachian backcountry. The plan was simple: take a scenic drive, camp under the stars, and make some memories. But by the time they'd hit the third day of their trip, the roads had turned from scenic highways to isolated, unmarked trails that didn't appear on any map. Their GPS had stopped working hours ago, and Alex's phone only flickered with a weak, useless signal. But Jake, ever the adventurous one, waved off their growing unease. "We're fine," he said, leaning between the front seats. "These kinds of roads always lead to cool places. Trust me, we'll hit civilization soon." They didn't. The sun sank behind the dense forest, and the single-lane dirt road seemed to stretch endlessly. Melissa's grip on her seatbelt tightened as she stared out the window. "We should turn back," she whispered. "This feels wrong." Natalie nodded in agreement. "If we even can turn back. I don't remember the last time we saw a spot wide enough to turn around." The road narrowed further, with thick trees looming so close on either side that their branches clawed at the windows. Alex slowed the car to a crawl, peering into the murky darkness ahead, his hands trembling slightly on the wheel. That's when they saw the house. It came into view so suddenly that Alex nearly hit the brakes. A single, crumbling structure stood on the side of the road, shrouded in shadow. Its windows were shattered, the front door hung askew, and the porch sagged dangerously. The whole place seemed to be slowly sinking into the earth, swallowed by creeping ivy and overgrown weeds. A battered wooden sign hung from a post near the driveway, the letters faded with age. "Miller family, welcome." "I'm not stopping," Alex said immediately, gripping the wheel tighter. He pressed the gas, but the car lurched instead of accelerating. "What the hell?" Alex muttered, pressing the pedal again. The engine roared, but the SUV didn't move. "Maybe it's stuck," Jake said, unbuckling his seatbelt. "I'll check it out." "No," Natalie snapped, grabbing his arm. "Are you serious? Look at that place." "Relax," Jake said with a forced chuckle, his bravado clearly masking his nerves. He grabbed a flashlight and stepped out into the cold night air. The beam of light wavered as he circled to the front of the car, then crouched down. Alex rolled down the window slightly. "What is it? Is something wrong?" Before Jake could answer, the flashlight flickered and went out. "Jake?" Melissa called, leaning toward the window. No reply. "Jake, quit messing around," Alex shouted. He leaned on the horn, the blaring sound echoing through the silent forest. And then they heard it. A soft tap, tap, tap against the back window. Melissa screamed, spinning around in her seat. The flashlight was lying on the ground behind the car, its beam flickering weakly. Beyond it, something was moving. A tall, thin figure emerged from the shadows, its face obscured by the dim light. It was humanoid, but wrong. its limbs too long, its movements jerky, as if it wasn't entirely in control of its own body. It tapped on the glass again, harder this time, its unnaturally long fingers leaving streaks on the dust-covered window. "Drive," Natalie shrieked, clutching Alex's arm. "I can't," Alex yelled back. "The car won't." The figure's head tilted, and for the first time they saw its face, or rather the absence of one. Its skin was pale and smooth, stretched taut over a blank expanse where its features should have been. No eyes, no nose, just a faint indentation where a mouth might have been. Melissa screamed again as the thing raised one hand and dragged its nails across the window, the sound shrill and piercing. Suddenly, the car rocked violently, as if something massive had slammed into it. Alex turned to the front just in time to see the car's hood buckle inward with a sickening crunch. Something was on top of the vehicle, its weight pressing the roof down, making the metal groan. "Get us out of here!" Natalie sobbed, clawing at Alex's arm. "I'm trying," Alex shouted, slamming the gas pedal repeatedly. The SUV finally lurched forward, the tires spinning before catching traction. The figure vanished from the window as the car sped down the road. But they weren't alone. The thing on the roof stayed with them, its weight shifting as it clawed at the edges of the car. Each swipe sent a horrible screech of metal and sparks flying into the night. Alex gritted his teeth, gripping the wheel as he pushed the SUV faster and faster, ignoring the low-hanging branches that scraped against the windshield like skeletal fingers. Suddenly, the weight on the roof disappeared. The car burst out of the tree line and onto an open stretch of road. Alex didn't dare stop, his foot glued to the gas. They drove for what felt like hours, the tension in the car suffocating as they waited for something, anything, to appear in the rearview mirror. Finally, the glow of distant headlights broke through the horizon. The sight of another car was enough to make Natalie burst into tears. Alex pulled to the side of the road, his shaking hands struggling to put the car in park. The other vehicle slowed and stopped. An older man stepped out, his face lined with concern. "You kids okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." Alex opened his mouth, but no words came out. The man frowned and stepped closer. "Where'd you come from?" "There's nothing back there but woods." Melissa finally found her voice. We broke down near a house, the Miller family's house." The man's face went pale. "Miller family? That place burned down 30 years ago. Ain't nobody lived there since." Alex turned to look at the SUV. Deep gouges ran along the roof and windows, the metal shredded like paper. "Then who the hell was that?" The long, winding road that cut through the dense forests of northern Maine was deserted, save for Claire and Ryan's small sedan. It was their yearly tradition to explore remote, lesser-traveled areas during the fall, chasing the stunning reds and golds of the foliage. The GPS had told them to turn on to an old country road, promising it would reconnect with the highway in a few miles. But the road hadn't reconnected. It had twisted and narrowed, the pavement eventually giving way to gravel and then to dirt. The sun dipped lower on the horizon, casting elongated shadows through the trees. "This doesn't feel right," Claire muttered, glancing out the window at the thickening forest. Ryan shot her a reassuring smile. "We're fine. These roads always feel endless. Worst case, we'll just double back." Claire didn't answer. Her unease had been growing ever since they'd passed a rotting sign a few miles back. It had been so weathered that most of the words were illegible, except for a single ominous phrase at the bottom. "Turn back before nightfall." "Do you think anyone actually lives out here?" Claire asked, more to herself than Ryan. The dense trees seemed impenetrable, the air eerily still, as though the entire forest was holding its breath. Ryan shrugged. "Maybe a few old cabins or hunters. That sign was probably just some local's idea of a joke." Then they saw it, a figure standing on the side of the road. Ryan slowed the car, his foot hesitating over the brake. The figure didn't move. It was a man dressed in tattered clothes, his back to them. His posture was unnaturally rigid, his head tilted slightly to one side. "Should we stop?" Ryan asked, though there was a note of hesitation in his voice. "No," Claire said quickly, gripping the edge of her seat. "Don't stop. Just go around him." Ryan nodded and eased the car to the left, giving the man a wide berth. As they passed, Claire kept her eyes locked on the stranger. His face was obscured by greasy, shoulder-length hair, but there was something off about the way he stood, too still like a statue. Once they were past him, Claire exhaled shakily. "That was weird." Ryan glanced in the rearview mirror, his brow furrowing. He's still just standing there. Don't look, Claire said, her voice rising. Just keep driving. Ryan didn't argue, his eyes fixed on the narrowing road ahead. The trees seemed to grow closer now, their gnarled branches reaching overhead to form a canopy that blocked out what little light remained. The dirt road became rougher, riddled with potholes that jostled the car, and then the headlights illuminated something ahead, another figure. It was a woman this time, standing in the middle of the road, her long dress tattered and swaying slightly in the breeze. Her head was bowed, her face obscured by a curtain of dark hair. Ryan swore under his breath. What the hell is going on? Claire grabbed his arm. Don't stop, just go around her like before. But as Ryan slowed, the woman raised her head. Her face was grotesque. Her eyes were sunken and too wide. Her lips stretched back unnaturally to reveal broken, jagged teeth. Her head twitched violently to one side, and she let out a high-pitched, keening wail that seemed to reverberate through the car. Drive! Claire screamed, clawing at Ryan's arm. Ryan slammed the gas pedal, the car surging forward. The woman didn't move, but as they swerved around her, Claire could have sworn she saw her grin, a horrible, knowing smile that sent ice coursing through her veins. The car sped down the road, the tires kicking up dust and gravel. Neither of them spoke, their breaths coming in ragged gasps as they tried to process what they'd just seen. Then something slammed onto the roof of the car. Claire screamed, clutching the dashboard as the vehicle rocked violently. Ryan gritted his teeth, gripping the wheel to keep control. The sound of scraping metal filled the air, followed by heavy thuds as whatever was on the roof crawled toward the front of the car. The windshield cracked. A pale, emaciated hand appeared, its fingers impossibly long and tipped with sharp, black nails. It dragged across the glass, leaving deep grooves as the thing's face came into view. It was the woman, her twisted grin pressed against the cracked glass, her eyes wild and bloodshot. She opened her mouth, and from her throat came a guttural, inhuman growl. Ryan swerved, slamming the car into a ditch. The sudden impact threw Claire forward, her seatbelt biting into her chest. The creature was flung from the roof, disappearing into the darkness. "Are you okay?" Ryan asked, his voice shaking as he fumbled to restart the engine. Claire nodded, though tears streamed down her face. "Just go, please. Let's just go." The engine roared to life, and Ryan reversed back onto the road. The car was battered, the windshield spider-webbed with cracks, but it moved. They drove in silence, their eyes darting nervously to the forest on either side. And then they saw the lights, a faint, flickering glow in the distance. It wasn't the harsh beam of headlights, but something softer, orange and uneven, like firelight. As they approached, they realized the road ahead was lined with torches, their flames casting eerie shadows on the surrounding trees. The torches led to a clearing. In the middle of the clearing was a circle of people, all standing perfectly still, their faces turned toward the car. Their features were blank, expressionless, their eyes reflecting the flickering light of the flames. At the center of the circle was the woman, her twisted grin wider than ever. Ryan hit the brakes, his hands trembling on the wheel. "We have to turn around," he whispered. Before they could move, the torches extinguished simultaneously, plunging the clearing into darkness. The last thing Claire heard was the sound of nails scraping against glass. Then, everything went black. The rain fell in relentless sheets, hammering against the windshield as Ethan squinted at the narrow, winding road ahead. The wipers worked furiously, but they couldn't keep up, leaving streaks of water that blurred the view. Beside him, his sister Sarah clutched her phone, trying in vain to find a signal. "Nothing," she muttered, her voice tense. "We shouldn't have taken this shortcut." Ethan sighed, gripping the wheel tighter. "We didn't have much of a choice. The main highway's flooded, remember?" "Yeah, but this road feels wrong," Sarah said, glancing out the window at the dense forest that crowded the edges of the pavement. "Like it's never meant to be used." He didn't respond. Truth be told, he felt it too, the oppressive atmosphere, the way the trees seemed to lean in closer, like they were watching. But he didn't want to freak Sarah out. They'd just get through it and find the motel waiting at the other end. Another curve loomed ahead, the road narrowing further as the trees closed ranks. The beams of the headlights caught something up ahead, a sign. Ethan slowed, his stomach sinking as he read the weathered, crooked lettering. Welcome to Pine Hollow, population 0. What the hell? Sarah said, leaning forward to get a better look. Population 0? Probably abandoned, Ethan said, though his voice wavered. Old ghost town or something. Nothing to worry about. He accelerated again, but the road seemed to stretch endlessly. Minutes turned to an hour, and still no sign of Pine Hollow, or any turnoffs for that matter. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, and the forest had grown darker, the trees now gnarled and twisted like arthritic hands clawing at the sky. Ethan, stop, Sarah said suddenly. Her voice was sharp, urgent. What? Why? Look. She pointed out the window. There, just off the side of the road, was a car, or what was left of one. It was old, rusted through, the metal twisted and mangled as if it had been left there for decades. Vines snaked through the shattered windows, and the tires were little more than crumbling rubber. The license plate was faded, unreadable. We're not stopping, Ethan said firmly, pressing the gas. They passed another car a few minutes later, then another. Each one more decayed than the last, their skeletal remains half swallowed by the earth. This doesn't make sense, Sarah whispered, her face pale. How can there be so many? There's no one out here. Before Ethan could answer, the car's engine sputtered. He glanced at the dashboard in alarm. The gas gauge, which had been hovering near half full, was suddenly pinned at empty. No, he muttered, his hands shaking as he tried to coax the car forward. It shuddered violently before rolling to a stop, the engine falling silent. Sarah looked at him, her eyes wide with fear. What do we do now? Ethan swallowed hard, his gaze darting to the forest. We wait. Someone will come along. She didn't look convinced. Neither was he. Hours passed. The rain stopped, but the oppressive silence was worse. It wasn't just quiet. It was dead. No wind, no rustling leaves, no chirping insects. Nothing. And then in the distance they saw headlights. Finally, Sarah exclaimed, waving her arms out the window. Hey, over here! The lights grew closer, brighter, but there was something off about them. They didn't move like a car's headlights. They bobbed and swayed, almost like they were floating. Ethan leaned forward, his unease deepening as the lights resolved into shapes. Lanterns. Figures emerged from the darkness, each holding a lantern in one hand and a long, rusted tool in the other, axes, scythes, and hammers. Their faces were obscured by strange masks, crudely carved from wood and painted with smeared, grotesque expressions. Get in the car, Ethan shouted, fumbling with the keys in a desperate attempt to restart the engine. Sarah locked the doors, her breath coming in panicked gasps. The masked figures surrounded the car, their lanterns casting flickering shadows that danced across the cracked windshield. One of them stepped forward, tilting its head as if studying them. Slowly, it raised its scythe and dragged the blade across the hood of the car, the sound like nails on a chalkboard. Go away, Sarah screamed, slamming her hands against the window. The figure didn't react. Ethan gritted his teeth and grabbed his phone, praying for a signal. Miraculously, one bar appeared. He dialed 911, his heart pounding as the call connected. 911, what's your emergency? A calm voice answered. We're stranded on a road near Pine Hollow, Ethan said quickly. There are people out here. Pine Hollow? The operator interrupted, her voice suddenly cold. That's impossible. What do you mean impossible? We're here and... You shouldn't be able to call from Pine Hollow, the operator continued. That town doesn't exist anymore. It was wiped off the map over 50 years ago. Everyone who went there never came back. The call disconnected. Ethan's blood ran cold. He looked up to see the figure outside the window, crouched now, its mask pressed against the glass. Behind it, the other figures stood motionless, their lanterns burning low. Then the car lights flickered and died, plunging them into complete darkness. The last thing they heard was the sound of glass shattering. The 5 of them, Ben, Lisa, Chris, Maddie, and Tony, had set out on a cross-country road trip with high spirits and a cooler full of snacks. The plan was to drive through the Nevada desert, camp under the stars, and reach California by the weekend. But somewhere between nowhere and nothing, their sense of adventure turned into creeping unease. It started with the gas station. The GPS had warned them that fuel was scarce along this stretch of desert highway, so they stopped at the first station they saw. It was a dilapidated relic, the paint peeling, the windows coated in grime. A single flickering bulb buzzed above the rusted pumps. Looks like something out of a horror movie, Maddie joked, though her laugh was strained. They pulled up to the pump, but the digital display was cracked and dark. Tony hopped out, grumbling about old equipment, and went to check inside. The others waited, the oppressive heat making the air feel heavy. "Why isn't he back yet?" Lisa said after several minutes. Before anyone could answer, Tony emerged, pale and visibly shaken. "We're leaving," he said, climbing into the car. "What about gas?" Chris asked. "Forget it," Tony snapped, slamming the door. "Just drive." Ben, behind the wheel, didn't argue. They sped away, leaving the crumbling station behind. Tony refused to explain what he'd seen, and the tension in the car grew thick. Then, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the headlights illuminated something ahead. A man stood in the middle of the road, facing away from them. He was wearing a suit, clean and pristine, completely out of place in the barren desert. "Should I honk?" Ben asked, slowing the car. "No," Tony said quickly. "Don't do anything. Just go around him." Ben eased the car to the side, but as they passed, the man's head turned impossibly far, his face pale and featureless. No eyes, no mouth, just smooth, blank skin. Lisa screamed. Ben swerved, and the car fishtailed before he regained control. "What the hell was that?" Chris yelled, twisting in his seat to look back. The road behind them was empty. "Drive," Tony said again, his voice barely a whisper. Ben floored it, the tires kicking up dust as they raced down the highway. For miles, no one spoke. The only sound was the hum of the engine and the static of the radio, which had failed to pick up a station since they'd left the gas station. As the night deepened, a faint glow appeared on the horizon. "Is that a town?" Maddie asked, her voice tinged with hope. But as they got closer, the glow revealed itself to be a massive neon sign, flickering erratically. "Welcome to Staten, a place you'll never leave." "That's not creepy at all," Chris muttered, though his attempt at humor fell flat. They entered the town cautiously. The streets were eerily empty, the buildings old and crumbling. A motel stood at the center, its sign flashing the word "vacancy" in blood-red letters. "We don't have much gas left," Ben said, pulling into the motel's parking lot. "We might not have a choice." The others reluctantly agreed. The motel lobby was dimly lit, and the air smelled stale. An old man sat behind the counter, his skin grayish and waxy as if he hadn't seen sunlight in decades. "2 rooms," Tony said quickly, tossing some cash onto the counter. The man's lips curled into a slow, unnatural grin. "Enjoy your stay," he rasped. Their rooms were adjacent, connected by a flimsy door that didn't lock properly. Lisa and Maddie took one room while the guys shared the other. The beds were stiff and the walls were thin, every creak and groan of the building echoing ominously. At 2 a.m., the knocking started. Ben jolted awake, the sound sharp and deliberate. Knock, knock, knock. He shook Chris awake, and the two of them stared at the door. "Who is it?" Ben called out, his voice trembling. No answer, just more knocking. Tony, already awake, motioned for them to stay quiet. He crept to the door and peered through the peephole. His face went pale. It's the man from the road," he whispered. "What? How?" Ben began, but Tony clamped a hand over his mouth. The knocking stopped. For several minutes, they sat frozen, listening. Then, from the other room, they heard Lisa scream. The 3 of them burst through the connecting door, finding Lisa and Maddie huddled in the corner. The window was shattered, the curtains flapping in the desert breeze. "Someone was outside," Lisa sobbed, "watching us." "We're leaving," Tony said, his voice firm. "Now." They grabbed their things and bolted, not even stopping to check out. The car's engine roared to life, and they sped out of Staten, the neon sign shrinking in the rearview mirror. But the road didn't lead back to the highway. No matter how far they drove, the same buildings kept appearing. The gas station, the motel, the empty diner. "We're going in circles," Maddie whispered, tears streaming down her face. "No," Tony said. His voice was hollow, defeated. "We're not. Look." Ahead of them, the neon sign blazed brighter than ever. "Welcome to Staten, a place you'll never leave." The radio crackled to life, a distorted voice whispering 3 chilling words, "You're already dead." The old, desolate highway stretched endlessly before them, cutting through the barren plains of West Texas like a scar. Marcus, Jade, and their dog, Baxter, were halfway through a cross-country move. Their U-Haul rattled over cracks in the pavement, loaded with everything they owned. As dusk fell, a storm began to brew. Lightning flickered on the horizon, illuminating the ominous silhouette of an approaching thunderhead. They hadn't seen another car in hours, and their cell phones showed no service. "This is starting to feel like a bad idea," Jade muttered, hugging her jacket tightly. Marcus shot her a reassuring smile, though his hands gripped the wheel a little tighter. "Relax," We'll hit a town soon. We just need to find somewhere to wait out the storm. Jade frowned, staring out the window. What town? There hasn't been a sign for miles. Baxter whined softly from the back seat, his ears pinned back. The dog's unease unsettled her more than the growing darkness. And then, as if summoned by her worry, the headlights caught a wooden sign on the roadside. Welcome to Devil's Crossing. Population, 623. Finally, Marcus said with relief, turning the truck onto the narrow road that led into town. The storm broke just as they reached Devil's Crossing. Rain hammered against the windshield and wind howled through the narrow streets. The town looked abandoned. The windows of the old brick buildings were dark, their glass cracked and fogged with grime. A few streetlights flickered weakly, casting distorted shadows. Are we sure this place isn't a ghost town? Jade asked. There's a gas station, Marcus said, pointing ahead. Let's stop there. The gas station was old-fashioned, with a single pump and a rickety wooden awning. A man stood under the shelter, his back turned to them. He was wearing a wide-brimmed hat and a long coat that whipped in the wind. Marcus parked and stepped out into the rain. Hey, sir, we're just passing through. Is there a motel or someplace we can stay? The man turned slowly. His face was pale and gaunt, with sunken eyes that seemed to absorb the dim light. When he spoke, his voice was low and raspy. You don't want to stay here. Jade rolled down her window. What do you mean? The man's eyes flicked to her. You'll see. Without another word, he stepped past Marcus and disappeared into the rain. What the hell was that about? Marcus muttered as he climbed back into the truck. Let's just keep driving, Jade said, her voice shaking. But the gas station's awning hadn't sheltered the pump's old mechanical display, and the U-Haul's gauge hovered precariously near empty. Reluctantly, they agreed to find a place to stay. At the center of town was a squat, two-story building with a faded sign that read, Crossing In. The lobby was empty except for a bell on the counter. Marcus rang it once, the sound echoing through the silence. Moments later, a woman appeared. She was thin and frail-looking, her movements unnaturally slow. Her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. Room for two? She asked, her voice soft and cold. And a dog, Jade added, pulling Baxter closer to her side. The woman's eyes lingered on the dog for a moment before she nodded. Room 6, top of the stairs. The room smelled faintly of mildew, but it was dry and warm. Jade bolted the door while Marcus fiddled with the ancient radiator. Baxter growled softly at the window, his hackles raised. There's nothing out there, Marcus said, peeking through the curtains. Just rain. Jade frowned, scratching behind the dog's ears. He doesn't usually act like this. They settled in uneasily. Jade dozed fitfully on the bed while Marcus tried to pass the time scrolling through old pictures on his phone. The storm outside seemed to grow louder, the wind rattling the windows. Around midnight, Marcus thought he heard footsteps in the hall. He froze, listening. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, and impossibly heavy. Baxter started growling again, his eyes fixed on the door. Someone's out there, Jade whispered, wide awake now. Marcus grabbed a chair and wedged it under the doorknob. Maybe it's just another guest. Jade shook her head. No one else was here. The footsteps stopped directly outside their door. There was a long pause and then a single knock. Neither of them moved. Baxter barked sharply, but the sound was swallowed by the wind. The knock came again, louder this time. Go away, Marcus shouted. The doorknob rattled violently and the chair slid an inch. Jade screamed, clutching Baxter as the dog barked furiously. Then silence. Marcus crept to the door and pressed his ear against it. The hall was quiet, but something scraped softly against the floorboards like claws or nails dragging across the wood. And then came the whisper, low, guttural, and right against the crack of the door, "You can't leave." Marcus stumbled back, his heart hammering in his chest. "We're leaving. Now." They gathered their things and bolted, Baxter leading the way. The hallway was empty, but the air felt heavy, oppressive. They didn't look back as they rushed down the stairs and out into the storm. The truck roared to life, and they sped through the empty streets. But as they reached the edge of town, Marcus slammed on the brakes. The road was gone. In its place was a massive black void, stretching endlessly in both directions. The headlights couldn't penetrate it. The darkness seemed alive, shifting and writhing like smoke. "We have to turn back," Jade whispered, her voice trembling. They reversed, the tires squealing on the wet pavement. But no matter which way they turned, the void was there, surrounding them, closing in. The last thing they saw was the neon sign of the gas station flickering in the distance. and the man in the wide-brimmed hat, standing motionless, watching. The whispers came again, filling the car, coming from everywhere and nowhere. "You'll see." The winding mountain road was cloaked in dense fog, the headlights of Amelia's car barely piercing through the gray haze. Her friends, Lucas and Harper, sat silently in the back seat, their earlier laughter now replaced by uneasy glances out the windows. In the passenger seat, Jake was staring at the map on his phone, which had inexplicably stopped updating their location an hour ago. "This doesn't feel right," Harper said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "And we should have hit the highway by now." Jake frowned. "The GPS says we're on the right road." Amelia tightened her grip on the wheel. "Yeah, but we've been driving in circles. Look at that." She pointed to a wooden sign they had passed for the third time. "Broken Pine. Next gas, 60 miles. Only now, the sign was different. The paint was cracked, the letters faded, and one corner of the sign was splintered as if something had clawed at it. Lucas leaned forward, his face pale. "I swear it didn't look like that before." Amelia glanced at him through the rearview mirror. "Maybe we're just tired. Let's keep moving. There has to be a way out." The car continued up the steep, narrow road, the tires crunching over gravel. The forest on either side seemed to grow darker, the trees leaning in closer, their twisted branches like skeletal fingers. Then the engine sputtered. "Don't do this," Amelia muttered, pressing the gas pedal. The car shuddered violently before coming to a dead stop. "No, no, no," she shouted, slamming her hands on the steering wheel. Jake checked his phone. No service. Harper tried hers. Same result. "What now?" Lucas asked, his voice cracking. "We stay put," Amelia said firmly. "We wait until morning. Someone will come by." But as they sat in the car, the oppressive silence of the forest began to press in on them. There were no sounds of birds, no rustling leaves, just the eerie, all-consuming quiet. And then came the knock. It was faint at first, a light tapping on the rear window. Harper let out a strangled scream, turning to see nothing but fog pressing against the glass. "Who's there?" Jake shouted, his voice echoing into the void. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, moving from one window to the next, as if something was circling the car. Amelia reached for her flashlight. "Stay here," she said, opening the driver's side door. "Are you insane?" Harper cried, grabbing her arm. "We can't just sit here!" Amelia snapped, shaking her off. She stepped into the fog, the beam of her flashlight slicing through the darkness. The air was damp and cold, and her breath puffed out in shaky clouds. She moved cautiously, circling the car. Nothing. When she returned to the driver's side, she froze. The fog had parted just enough to reveal something standing at the edge of the forest. A figure, tall and impossibly thin, like with limbs that seemed too long, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. "Amelia!" Jake hissed from the car. "Get in! Now!" She didn't need to be told twice. Slamming the door behind her, she locked it and started frantically turning the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life, and they sped away, the figure disappearing into the fog. But the road didn't lead them out. Instead, it wound deeper into the forest, the trees becoming more grotesque, their bark twisted into faces, contorted in silent screams. Then they saw the house. It appeared out of nowhere, a massive, decaying mansion with broken windows and a front door that hung slightly ajar. A dim light flickered inside. "Keep driving," Lucas said urgently. "We're running out of gas," Amelia said through gritted teeth. "We have no choice." Reluctantly, they pulled up to the house. The air seemed heavier here, the fog clinging to the ground like a living thing. "I'll check it out," Jake said, grabbing the flashlight. "Stay here." "No way," Amelia said. "We stick together." The four of them stepped out, Baxter staying close to Harper's leg, growling low in his throat. The porch creaked under their weight as they approached the door. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of rot. The walls were lined with dusty portraits, each depicting a figure with hollow eyes and expressionless faces. A chandelier hung precariously from the ceiling, its crystals clinking softly with an unseen draft. "This place is a nightmare," Harper whispered. As they moved deeper into the house, the door slammed shut behind them. Everyone spun around, hearts pounding, but the doorway was empty. "We're not alone," Lucas said, his voice barely audible. The sound of footsteps echoed from upstairs, slow, deliberate, heavy. "Let's go," Jake said, heading back toward the door. But no matter how hard he pulled, it wouldn't budge. "Upstairs," Amelia said. "There might be another way out." Reluctantly, they climbed the grand staircase, the wood groaning under their weight. At the top, the hallway stretched out in both directions, lined with more of the haunting portraits. One of them moved. Harper screamed as the figure in the painting turned its head to look at her, its hollow eyes now filled with something dark and alive. "Run!" Amelia shouted, pulling her friend down the hall. They burst into a room at the end of the corridor and slammed the door shut behind them. The room was empty except for a single mirror hanging on the far wall. Their reflections stared back at them, except something was off. "Why do we look wrong?" Lucas asked, his voice trembling. In the mirror, their faces were distorted, their eyes sunken and mouths twisted into unnatural grins. Then the reflections began to move, stepping closer, even as they stood frozen in place. "Break it!" Jake yelled. Amelia grabbed a chair and hurled it at the mirror. It shattered, and the room plunged into darkness. When they opened their eyes, they were back in the car, the engine running, the headlights cutting through the fog. "Was that a dream?" Harper whispered. But as they drove, the road led them straight back to the mansion. The front door was wide open, waiting. The four friends, Mia, Ryan, Jess, and Ethan, had planned their trip for months. A road trip through the Appalachian Mountains sounded like the perfect mix of adventure and relaxation. They didn't factor in getting lost. The GPS cut out hours ago, leaving them winding along unmarked roads. Night fell, and with it came a suffocating darkness. The headlights of their SUV barely illuminated the dense trees crowding the roadside. "We should have hit the highway by now," Ryan muttered, gripping the map they'd printed as backup. Jess, sitting in the back, pressed her face against the window. "What's that up ahead?" Mia slowed the car. The beam of the headlights revealed a battered sign leaning at a hollow. Population 47. "Finally a town," Ethan said, though his voice lacked enthusiasm. The car crept forward. Red Hollow was less a town and more a cluster of decaying buildings, a gas station with shattered windows, a general store boarded up long ago, a church with a crooked steeple. The only light came from a diner, its neon sign buzzing weakly. Open 24 hours. "Let's ask for directions," Mia suggested. "Is this really the best idea?" Ryan asked, his eyes darting nervously to the shadows beyond the trees. "Do you have a better one?" Mia shot back. They parked in front of the diner. Inside, a single waitress stood behind the counter, wiping it with slow, deliberate movements. Her uniform was stained and her expression blank. A single patron, an old man with a weathered face, sat at a booth near the window, nursing a cup of coffee. The group hesitated. Jess was the first to step inside, followed by the others. The bell above the door jingled weakly, and the waitress looked up. Her eyes didn't meet theirs, but instead lingered just past them, as if watching something only she could see. "Evening," Mia said, forcing a polite smile. "We're lost. Could you help us find the highway?" The waitress didn't answer. She just stared. The old man in the booth chuckled, a sound that was more rasp than laugh. "You ain't getting out tonight," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "Not with them around." Ethan frowned. "Them?" The man took a slow sip of his coffee, then pointed out the window. "The Watchers." The group turned to look. At first, they saw nothing but the dark outline of trees. Then shapes began to emerge. Tall, thin silhouettes, dozens of them, standing motionless at the edge of the forest. "Oh my God," Jess whispered. "What are they?" The old man set his coffee down. "They've been here as long as the town. Nobody knows what they want, but if you're smart, you'll stay inside." Ryan pulled out his phone, hoping for some miraculous return of service, but the screen was blank. "We need to leave," he said, his voice shaking. "Now." "Suit yourself," the man said with a shrug. "But they'll follow." Mia grabbed Jess's arm and led her out, the others close behind. The moment they stepped outside, the air grew colder. The shapes at the tree line hadn't moved, but they felt closer now, as if the darkness itself had pushed them forward. "Get in the car," Mia hissed. They piled into the SUV, Mia fumbling with the keys. The engine roared to life, and the headlights flooded the road. The shapes didn't retreat. Instead, they seemed to stretch, their limbs unnaturally long, their heads tilting at impossible angles. "Drive," Ethan shouted. Mia floored it. The tires skidded on the gravel before catching, and the car shot forward. The road twisted and turned, the forest pressing in on all sides. In the rearview mirror, the shapes followed, gliding effortlessly, their movements jerky and wrong. "How are they keeping up?" Jess cried, clutching Ryan's arm. The headlights illuminated a fork in the road. "Left or right?" Mia yelled. "Right," Ryan shouted. She turned sharply, the car skidding again. The watchers appeared on the road ahead, as if they had always been there waiting. Impossible, Ethan whispered. Mia swerved, narrowly avoiding the figures. As they passed, one of the watchers turned its head, revealing a face, or lack of one. It was blank, featureless, yet somehow still staring. Keep going, Ryan urged. The road grew rougher, the SUV bouncing over potholes. The forest thinned, replaced by barren fields. Then, in the distance, they saw it. A bridge. That's our way out, Mia said, her voice strained with determination. The watchers gathered at the edge of the wall of motionless figures. Mia didn't slow down. She clenched the wheel and drove straight at them. The car passed through the watchers as if they weren't there. The figures dissolved into shadow, the cold air filling the cabin with an unnatural chill. They crossed the bridge, the road ahead leading into open plains. The watchers didn't follow. Mia didn't stop until they reached the next town, collapsing into the nearest parking lot. No one spoke for several minutes, their breaths coming in short, panicked gasps. What the hell was that? Ryan finally asked. No one had an answer. But when Mia glanced at the back of the car, her blood ran cold. On the dusty rear window, a single handprint was pressed into the glass, far too large and misshapen to be human.